July 14, 1941. The outskirts of Rudnya, a small town in the Smolensk region of the Soviet Union. The air, thick with the cloying scent of pine resin and damp earth, carried the distant, familiar thump of German 10.5 cm LFH-18 howitzers methodically pounding Soviet positions. For Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 52nd Infantry Division, it was the soundtrack of a successful war. From the edge of a captured birch forest, he watched the shelling through his field glasses. Geysers of black soil and splintered wood erupted along the distant tree line. It was a precise mathematical exercise in destruction, a fire mission. Calculate, fire, adjust, repeat. It was the German way of war, orchestrated, efficient, and brutally logical. Around him, his men, grimy and weary but confident, checked their Mauser rifles and redistributed ammunition belts. They were the spearhead of Army Group Center, the unstoppable force that had plunged hundreds of miles into the Soviet colossus. The initial shock of Operation Barbarossa had worn off, replaced by a grinding, but seemingly inevitable, advance. The enemy fought with a stubborn, almost reckless fury, but their tactics were often clumsy, their equipment inferior. Their artillery was no different, sometimes fierce, but ultimately predictable. You could hear the report of their guns, you could hear the shell incoming, and if you were a veteran, you could almost tell where it would land. Richter lowered his glasses, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. Another 10 minutes, and we advance. The Ivans will be softened up nicely. His senior sergeant, a grizzled veteran of the Great War named Voss, merely grunted, his eyes scanning the scarred landscape. He had less faith in the neat equations of the staff officers. This country, vast and brooding, felt different. The rules here seemed malleable. Then, a new sound cut through the routine thunder of the German barrage. It was not the deep-throated cough of a howitzer or the sharp crack of a field gun. It was something else entirely, a series of sharp electric whooshes, a chorus of screeches that tore the fabric of the sky. Psh, boom, psh, boom. It was a sound that belonged not on a battlefield, but in a nightmare. Richter's head snapped up. His men froze, their instincts confused. There was no single identifiable gun report to locate, no whistle of an incoming round to duck from. Just this hellish, rising scream from everywhere at once. Sergeant Voss was the first to break the paralysis. "Get down! Everyone into the craters! Now!" His roar was swallowed by the escalating cacophony. The sky to the east, over the Soviet lines, flickered with dozens of sudden, fleeting suns, the launch flashes of something unimaginable. A moment later, the world ended, not in a series of distinct explosions, but in one continuous cataclysmic roar. The entire horizon ahead of them vanished behind a walking wall of fire and earth that advanced like a biblical plague. The ground beneath their feet convulsed, not in separate jolts, but in a constant, sickening tremor. Trees were shredded into matchsticks, fortified positions simply ceased to exist, and the air itself turned to fire and shrapnel. This was not precision, this was annihilation. For 40 seconds, the universe was reduced to sound and fury. The initial deafening cataclysm subsided into a chaotic, rumbling aftermath, but the assault was not over. The first salvo had been a single, devastating note. Now the screech began again, a fresh wave of that unearthly chorus from the east. Boom, boom. Another volley, and then another. The Soviets were not firing in a precise staccato. They were conducting a symphony of pure, undiluted destruction. The ground where the German forward observation posts and lead companies had been was no longer a battlefield. It was a churning, smoking hellscape, a geological wound torn into the earth. Lieutenant Richter pushed himself up from the mud, his ears ringing, his body vibrating with the residual shock. He blinked, trying to clear the dust and smoke from his eyes. The familiar world was gone. The neat lines of the birch forest were now a tangled mess of splintered trunks. The craters from his own artillery were swallowed by vast, overlapping pits of raw soil. He saw a mangled field kitchen, a gun carriage flipped onto its back like a child's toy, and things that were no longer recognizable as human. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, burnt wood, and the sickly sweet, coppery tang of high explosive. "Report!" he tried to shout, but his voice was a ragged croak. No one answered. Sergeant Voss stumbled towards him, his face a mask of grime and blood from a minor cut on his forehead. His eyes, usually so calm and calculating, were wide with a primal fear Richter had never seen in him. "Mein Leutnant." What was that?" Voss stammered, his voice trembling. There was no warning, no incoming whistle, nothing. Richter couldn't answer. His military mind, trained for geometry and ballistics, was short-circuiting. He looked through his field glasses again, his hands shaking. There were no distinct gun positions to counter battery fire against. No muzzle flashes to triangulate. The rockets had been fired from mobile launchers on trucks, miles away, and by now they were likely already moving, reloading, preparing to do this again, somewhere else. This was not dueling with an enemy artillery regiment. This was like standing before a force of nature, a volcano or an earthquake. You couldn't outmaneuver an earthquake. He watched as a young medic, his uniform stained and face pale, scrambled towards a shallow crater. He retched violently, then simply sat down in the mud, staring at nothing, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He was not wounded, but he was broken. This was the other weapon, the one not measured in kilotons of explosive yield. Psychological shock. The German way of war was built on a foundation of control, of off-trags tactic, mission-type tactics that relied on individual initiative within a structured framework. But this was chaos weaponized. It didn't target your position, it targeted your entire sector. It didn't seek to kill a specific machine gun nest, it sought to erase a square kilometer of the Earth from the map. The precision they took such pride in was suddenly, terrifyingly obsolete. In the face of this saturation fire, the elegant calculations of a staff officer were as useful as a water pistol against a flamethrower. The stench of ozone and scorched earth clung to the inside of General der Artillerie Friedrich von Arnim's nostrils as his staff car bounced along the shattered road towards the front. He had come forward personally, against the advice of his aides, because the initial reports made no sense. "A single battery cannot inflict such casualties," he had muttered, studying the frantic ink-smudged map markers at his headquarters. "The Russians must have concentrated an entire artillery division in that sector overnight. It is impossible." Now, as he stepped out onto the still warm soil, he understood. It was not impossible. It was something new. He found Lieutenant Richter and Sergeant Voss near what was left of a command post, a hastily dug hole now partially collapsed. The men saluted, their movements sluggish, their eyes hollow. They were not the confident soldiers of the morning's briefing. They were men who had stared into the abyss of a new kind of warfare. Richter began his report, his voice flat, reciting the facts as he knew them, the unearthly sound, the absence of warning, the total saturation of the area. "Show me," von Arnim interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. Richter led him to a vantage point. The general, a man who had spent his life studying the art and science of ballistics, surveyed the devastation. His trained eye immediately noted the key. Terrifying difference. This was not the pattern of conventional shelling. There were no neat clusters of craters from a battery finding its range. Instead, the landscape was a pock-marked moonscape, the impacts overlapping in a random, horrifyingly dense pattern. It was the difference between a surgeon's scalpel and a blast from a fire hose. A single well-placed 10.5 cm shell could disable a gun emplacement. This required nothing to be well-placed. It simply required enough firepower to make precision irrelevant. "Sergeant," von Arnim said, turning to Voss, "your assessment, as a front soldier." Voss swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Herr General, it is demoralizing. There is no defense. You cannot hear it coming. You cannot take cover from it. It does not matter if you are in a foxhole or in the open. When it comes, God decides." He gestured a trembling hand towards the blasted land. "It is not war as we know it. It is..." Punishment. The word hung in the air. Punishment. Von Arnim's mind raced, connecting the tactical reality to the strategic nightmare. The Wehrmacht's entire operational doctrine, the essence of blitzkrieg, was based on speed, concentration, and maneuver. Their artillery was a precise tool used to soften specific strongpoints, pave the way for panzers and grenadiers. But this Soviet weapon, this Stalin orgel, as the men were already starting to call it, Stalin's organ, rendered that doctrine suspect. How do you concentrate your forces when the enemy can, without warning, deluge a square kilometer with high explosives in seconds? How do you maneuver when the very ground you need to cross can be transformed into a fiery kill zone in the time it takes to relay a fire order to your own, methodical artillery? He looked at the faces of the men around him. He saw the fear, not of death, but of helplessness. Their tactical wisdom, their hard-won experience, was suddenly worthless. The rules had been rewritten. The general turned away from the carnage, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The report he would have to file would not be about a local setback. It would be a warning. The war in the East had just changed its character. The age of precision was being challenged by the dawn of the age of annihilation. The following hours were a numb, mechanical exercise in damage control. The promised advance for that day was cancelled. Instead, the men of the 52nd Infantry were tasked with the grim calculus of counting their dead and digging new positions further back. The medical teams worked with a frantic, hopeless energy, but there were surprisingly few wounded to treat. In the zones of maximum impact, the concept of wounded had been rendered obsolete. The concussive overpressure and the dense shrapnel patterns had ensured a horrifying efficiency. Lieutenant Richter moved through his shattered company, the names on his roster becoming crosses in the soft black earth. The confidence that had propelled them from the Polish border to the gates of Smolensk had been vaporized as completely as the men in the forward trenches. Back at the division command post, a captured Russian radio crackled with excited, distorted voices. A German intelligence officer, fluent in Russian, listened intently, his face growing pale. He scribbled notes, then approached General von Arnim. "Herr General, they are calling it Katyusha," the officer said, his voice low. "A pet name, like Little Katie." The grotesque contrast between the affectionate nickname and the weapon's apocalyptic effect was not lost on anyone in the bunker. It was a piece of psychological warfare in itself, a mundane, almost gentle name for an instrument of pure terror. For the German High Command, the encounter at Rudnya was a data point that would be analyzed, codified, and filed away. They would eventually create their own versions, the Nebelwerfer, but they would never fully integrate the philosophy of the Katyusha. Their military soul was too rooted in precision, in the economical application of force. The Soviet approach was different. It was a brutal industrial philosophy. If one shell might not hit the target, then fire 40. If 40 might miss, then fire 400. It was a terrifying reflection of the vast inhuman scale of the war they were now fighting. As dusk settled over the broken forest, Sergeant Voss found Lieutenant Richter staring east, towards the silent Soviet lines. The sergeant offered him a captured cigarette. They smoked in silence for a long moment, the tobacco doing little to cut through the taste of destruction. "They will use it again," Richter said finally, his voice hollow. It wasn't a question. Voss nodded, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Every time we mass for an attack, every time we establish a supply depot, every time we think we have a secure line." He gestured with the cigarette towards the deep gouges in the earth. "This wasn't just a new weapon, Herr Leutnant. It was a message. They are not playing by our rules anymore. They are building a new game, and the board is made of fire." The truth of it settled over them, as cold and heavy as the coming night. The tactical paradigm they had mastered was crumbling. The war of movement and maneuver was now shadowed by the threat of instantaneous, area-wide obliteration. The shrieking descent of Stalin's organs had not just killed men and shattered equipment. It had shattered a fundamental assumption of German military superiority. From this day forward, every advance, every defensive position, would be planned under the terrifying shadow of the rocket's scream. The reports from the front line, filtered through the chain of command, lost the visceral horror but retained chilling tactical clarity. In war rooms far from the smell of cordite and the screams of the wounded, staff officers pored over maps and damage assessments. The initial German designation was matter of fact: Stalin Orgel, Stalin's organ, for the weapon's multiple launch rails resembling the pipes of a church organ. But the clinical name belied a profound unease. The intelligence briefing delivered to the Oberkommando des Heers, OKH, stated it plainly. The enemy has deployed a new type of area saturation rocket artillery. Its psychological effect is significant. Its tactical implication is that we can no longer rely on the survivability of concentrated forces in forward assembly areas. For the men in the line, the psychological shockwave propagated faster than any official report. The story of the weapon that could turn a square kilometer into hell in seconds spread through the ranks in hushed tones, exaggerated with each retelling. It bred a new kind of anxiety, a hypervigilance directed not at visible enemy positions, but at the empty, threatening sky. The sound of the wind through the pines could now make a veteran soldier flinch. The Eastern Front, already a brutal contest of attrition, had acquired a new, capricious god. General von Arnim drafted his own dispatch, a more personal and grimly philosophical addendum to the official after-action review. He wrote of the demoralization of the unknown, arguing that the Katyusha's greatest strength was not its explosive payload, but its ability to invalidate the hard-earned survival instincts of the German soldier. A man could learn to duck from a mortar's cough, to press himself into the earth at the whistle of an incoming shell. But against this, there was no learning. There was only prayer. He concluded with a warning that would prove prophetic. We face an enemy whose industrial and doctrinal evolution we have catastrophically underestimated. They have leapfrogged the concept of precision and embraced the doctrine of overwhelming force. This is not a temporary advantage. It is a glimpse of the future of warfare. Days later, Lieutenant Richter's depleted company was pulled back for a brief respite in a rear area village.